Hi everybody, what's going on? This is Matt, and today I wanted to talk about how long does it take to be fluent. And this is a question that I think a lot of people have when they want to learn a language, and it always comes up. And I wanted to take a little bit more time than some of the other videos out there to talk about fluency, gonna go into a little bit more depth. So this will be a longer video, so just keep that in mind. And it's kind of interesting because when you talk about fluency, and how long does it take? This is just something that comes up all the time, and I think that for a lot of people, they'll ask this question because first off, do they even want to invest the time to learn a language, right? Like, how realistic is it for them to learn this language? Do they even want to put that time in to get this good? And then I think for some people, they've already been learning the language and they just want to know, how much further do they have to go? Where do they stand with all the effort and time they put into the language? So, I think that it's really important, first off, to ask yourself the question, why do you want to be fluent? What is your end goal with language learning? Because in a lot of cases, for people, it's not the end of the world for them to be fluent. And they're not trying to become a diplomat or something, to use this language in a professional context. It's really not the end of the world. In other cases, that is the case. And, they really need to reach a high skill level, make few grammatical mistakes and things like that. But I think that the reason why asking yourself this question is so important is because, the answer to how long it takes to be fluent is, I think going to you're going to have a little bit different of a reaction, right? Because in a lot of cases, you don't really need to be fluent to enjoy the language learning process, right? In the end of the day, for a lot of people, they want to just experience the language as, as in some sort of competent fashion, right? They want to talk to others in the language that they're learning. They want to listen to audio content. They want to watch movies, TV shows, podcasts, YouTube videos. They want to read books in a foreign language, maybe play video games. And you don't need to necessarily be fluent to do those things. On the other hand, the more competent that you are, the more that you can enjoy those things, and the better that experience will probably be. But I think that's an important distinction to make. Now, I don't want to do that cop-out argument where, the length of time for fluency is far less because you don't need it to reach that level, right? I think there's some videos out there that kind of give that, I think, misleading perception. But I do want to kind of to talk about that question at first because it's really important for kind of setting the framework for what fluency means to you and how long it's going to take. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started and talk about how long does it take to be fluent in a foreign language. So when we talk about fluency, the reality is that the answer is not very clear, and it's just full of different shades of gray, right? There's a lot of different ways to interpret what fluency is, and if you go on the internet and do a search, you'll get a lot of different answers out there. And the reality is that learning a language theoretically never ends. I mean, you can always get better at the language that you're learning. You can make less mistakes. You can learn even more words that you don't know that are very uncommon. So it's very difficult in a lot of ways to answer this question of, how long does it take to be fluent? That being said, though, there are a few places that you can look at to kind of give you some rough idea on how long it'll take to be fluent and what fluency actually means. So think of things like the FSI or the CEFR. And outside of those organizations, I also think that there's kind of practical ways to see your level without taking a test or even using some of these benchmarks, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the reality is, and the main point I want to kind of express here is that it's really a very gray answer. It's not going to be so clear cut. Here it is, and there's no caveats, right? You really need to understand that this answer is got different shades of gray, and it's going to not be the easiest thing to answer in a lot of cases. So a few things also I wanted to talk about before kind of going into some of these organizations or kind of benchmarks out there is that there's a lot of things that can really affect the length of time it takes for you to reach fluency. And probably the biggest thing is that the method that you're using to learn a language. I mean, the reality is that there are certain methods and there are certain apps out there that are more effective than others, right? There's better ways to acquire vocabulary. There's good ways to practice listening, and there's resources out there to help you read more efficiently. So the reality is that depending on what app you're using, what books you're using, or methods, it can definitely affect the length of time it takes to reach fluency, whether it's a shorter amount of time or a longer amount of time. The other thing too is that your mindset, energy level, and other external factors can definitely influence the length of time it takes to you to reach fluency. So if you're super motivated, you're feeling good and confident, you'll probably learn the material a lot better versus if you are distracted, discouraged, not feeling the best. And same goes with just being tired all the time when you are learning a language, right? Like if you're sleep deprived, you're probably going to retain a lot less vocabulary versus if you're very well rested, you're feeling good. The other thing too is that there are different areas of skill at the language that you're learning. So for example, you can be really good at reading, you can have a lot of vocabulary, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be great at speaking, right? You're going to have to put in time to just get comfortable with expressing yourself in the language that you're learning. Same with something like listening, where you might have a really good vocabulary, you can read very well, but your listening skill might be lacking a little bit because you just need to get comfortable with that. So when we talk about fluency, it's not just this kind of one single metric, right? You can be good or be better at certain skills compared to others, right? Like your reading could be very at a very high level, but your listening or speaking could be lacking a little bit. Another thing too is that where your focus currently is also going to affect the length of time it takes to reach fluency, right? So maybe it makes the most sense right now to practice listening, but you're focusing in on speaking, right? Just where you're putting your time in could be giving you kind of more value at that current moment or less value. So, where you're putting time and investment in and energy in is going to affect the time it takes for you to reach fluency, because chances are there's certain things that you probably could work on right now that will kind of give you more gains compared to other things. And then lastly, there's other kind of things out there that can help you, such as being immersed in the foreign language, whether that's living in another country, or other advantages. Maybe you've learned a language before, and so thus you know what the best apps are. You have experience with the language. So these other factors can also affect how long it might take you to reach fluency. So when you look at some of the hour totals out there or things like that, just keep in mind that all these things listed here and probably others are going to affect the time it's going to take you to reach fluency. So the first kind of benchmark that I want to talk about is the Foreign Service Institute, or the FSI. The FSI is a US government organization that has a lot of experience with language instruction. And on their website, they have a series of languages that are divided into 4 different categories, with the higher levels taking a longer amount of time to reach a professional working proficiency. And I think it's really important to note that when you look at the hour totals on the FSI, they're really just a rough guidepost, at least in the context of the self-studying language learner, because even on their website, they note that it's based on the average for their students. So obviously factors like being exposed to the language prior to instruction or other factors can affect the amount of time it takes to reach fluency. The other thing too is that the FSI probably has certain resources and advantages that are not available to the normal self-studying language learner, right? It's a very intense environment. You have a lot of resources and opportunities to practice speaking with others. You're probably fully immersed in that program, learning the language, all day. And so for the average language learner, you don't really have that distinct advantage. So it might take you longer than the hour totals that you see listed there. Maybe if you have prior experience with the language or something like that, it might take you less time. But I think what's important to note here is that it's a rough guidepost. You can use it as kind of some sort of goal, some sort of measure to see how long it might take you to reach a certain degree of competency in the language that you're learning. And so here is the Foreign Service Institute's website. It has a lot of really interesting and useful information. I'll leave a link in the description of this video. But here you actually can see the different categories that I was talking about, with the class hour totals to reach a professional working proficiency. And so with category one languages, you have languages such as Italian, Spanish, French, or Portuguese requiring 600 to 750 class hours. We have category two languages with 900 class hours for German or Indonesian. We have category three languages, or about 1100 class hours for Greek, Russian, and some other languages here. And category four languages, or about 2200 class hours for Arabic, Japanese, and Chinese and Korean. And I want to talk about the hour totals in a little bit more depth in just a minute. So if you're a little intimidated by these numbers, don't be. I want to talk about it in some more depth, but I want to cover a couple of other things before jumping into that. So another good way to measure your proficiency in a language is the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, or the CEFR. And levels start at A1 and move all the way up to A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2, with C2 being the highest level of proficiency. And there are tests out there to help you identify your proficiency level, but it's important to note that they're just tests in the end of the day. You can pass a test, but it might not necessarily mean that you're at that level, right? So I think that these are good ways to kind of measure how good you are at a language, and you can take the self-assessment or just look at the self-assessment table and kind of somewhat gauge where you are. For a lot of people, B2 is kind of roughly what people would think of as fluency, or maybe C1, B2 or C1. That's probably a very high skill level in the language. With C2, in a lot of cases, is very native or very close to a native like skill level. So I think there's a lot of cases where people overestimate their abilities in languages. So when I think of C2, it's a very high skill level, like very near native level. But when people talk about fluency, I think probably a good benchmark to look at is that B2 C1 level. And here you can see the website for the CEFR. There's a lot of really interesting information you can look at on the website. I'll link it in the description below. But what's also important is this basically self-assessment grid. And so we just look at it in English, for example. You can see what each of the levels roughly means in the context of listening, reading, speaking, and writing. And so, like I said, I think that B2 C1 is a good kind of guidepost for fluency or a very high skill level. C2 I would like to think of as kind of near native like ability. So you can use this and try to be objective as possible to kind of gauge where you are in terms of your overall skill level. I'll link this down in the description below as well. But this is also a good kind of, I think, benchmark for just seeing where you're at and where you want to go with the language. So with all that being said, I wanted to take a look at this table, which I made using the FSI data and also referencing the CEFR. And basically we have the four categories that were mentioned in the FSI, with category one being like French or Spanish, which requires somewhere around 600 to 750 class hours to reach a business-like proficiency, and category four languages being more around 2200 class hours. Now, what I think is important to note is that you don't need to necessarily, I think, reach these hour totals to enjoy the language, right? And when I think about these hour totals, I like to think that it's probably somewhere around a B2 C1 level. Now, I could be wrong about this. Maybe it's less than that or higher, but let's just for this assumption, assume it's somewhere around a B2 C1 level. And I think that if you reach a B1 level in a language, that gives you a lot of opportunity to really enjoy compelling content in the language that you're learning, whether that's playing video games, reading, listening to podcasts, watching YouTube videos, things like that, where you can start having a lot of fun in the language. And so if you think about those hour totals being somewhere around a B2 C1 level, obviously the time it takes to reach a B1 level is going to be far less than that. Now, the thing about it is that obviously the better that you get at the language, the more that you're going to enjoy that content, the more you're going to enjoy reading content, video games, or podcasts or something like that, because you're just going to be better at the language. You're going to understand more. You could probably consume more difficult content. But basically, if we look at these hour totals, right, if we look at a category one language, and let's say you study 1 hour daily, it's probably going to take you between 20 to 25 months to reach that fluency, or about 2 years. If you do it and do 2 hours of study daily, it'll probably take you around a year. Versus if we look at something like a category three language, like Russian or something like that, 1 hour daily is probably going to take you roughly 3 years to reach that um, fluency target, right? And this might seem very intimidating to a lot of people, right? It's like, oh, wow, that's a long time to be learning a language. But that doesn't necessarily, I think, represent the amount of time it's going to take you to start enjoying the language learning process, right? So if we assume that the B1 level is this kind of rough target where you can start enjoying a lot of compelling content, we can make an assumption about how long it takes to get to B1, right? So let's say to reach B1, it's going to range between 25 to 50% of the total hour total. Well, on a category one language, that's probably somewhere between 150 to 375 hours, or about 6 to 12 months with 1 hour of study daily. Or for a category two language, 7.5 to 16 months, or for a category four language, 18 to 36 months. Now, those 25 to 50% ranges are just estimates. And obviously, you probably enjoy compelling content, maybe not even necessarily at a B1 level, but maybe even in the A levels. It really just depends. It's just an estimate. But the reason why I kind of put those numbers out there is that, don't feel so intimidated that, you have to reach this fluency target, this 600 to 750 class hour number, or this 1100 class hour number to have fun in the language, or to get something out of this process, right? Like, you can enjoy compelling content, you can read, you can listen to audio content that's interesting at hour totals that are far less than that number, right? Through the assumptions that I've made here, such as 25 or 50% of the total for a roughly B1 level. And like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be those hour totals. It could be less, but I think it helps to kind of puts things into context where, you can have fun and you can have a lot of skill in the language without being at that exact hour total. I think that's really important to note. But it's also kind of interesting and relevant to point out, like, okay, if I put an hour in every single day, how long is it going to take for me to get to that proficiency level in the language? And from my own experience, and I think just reading what other people's experience has, when you kind of look at the time investment that each of these categories have for each of the languages, this seems about right? Whether it's like 2 or 3 years to get to a very high skill level. So I think that when you look at these hour totals and you kind of think about it as studying an hour every single day and how long it takes in terms of just a year or 2 or 3 years to get to a fair level, I think a lot of these kind of assumptions make sense. Now, I wanted to take another approach on looking at fluency and ask the question, what is your ability to enjoy compelling content? Because for a lot of people, it doesn't really matter if you are a B2 level or a C1 level, or you've passed some exam, right? For a lot of people, they don't necessarily need to use this language in a professional context or prove their ability to somebody. And in a lot of ways, people just want to enjoy the language. They want to speak with others. They want to read in the language that they're learning, listen to audio content, play video games, and things like that. And so really, it's all about, what is your ability to enjoy compelling content? And when we looked at that table and the estimates of reaching B1 or something like that, it becomes a lot less intimidating to reach those targets, to kind of start enjoying the language process, right? Because while you might not be perfect reading, or you might make mistakes when you're speaking, or you might not understand everything when you're listening to audio content, you are really experiencing the language. You're enjoying compelling content. And so, yeah, maybe you're not a C1 level, but you're enjoying things. And if you keep putting in that time and effort, you're going to get better at the language and eventually reach those targets. So rather than looking at hour totals sometimes, or some of these levels like B1, B2, I think it's important just to ask yourself, what is your ability to enjoy compelling content? Whether that's, can you read in a foreign language? Are you getting better at that? Can you play video games with some difficulty or with some ease? How about listening to audio content or even just practicing speaking? In a lot of ways, the levels really don't matter, right? It's just, where are you in your path to enjoying compelling content? So, I mean, if you can have a conversation partner and just talk about so many different things, maybe you can talk about politics, the economic situation in the world, video games, your hobbies. Like, who cares if you are defined as a C1 level or B2, right? You're enjoying compelling conversations with another person, right? Maybe you're making mistakes. Maybe you have to use certain words, but you're enjoying that conversation, right? Let's say you're reading literature in another language. Maybe you have to look up a couple words. It's difficult at times, but you're reading in that language, or you're playing video games, or listening to podcasts. And in a lot of cases, that's really what matters. So I think that it's important sometimes to not get too caught up on those hour totals, to not get too caught up on whether or not you're a B1 or B2, because in a lot of cases, it's really just what is your ability to enjoy compelling content. And that's really what matters, I think, for a lot of people and their goals of learning a language, right? They don't really care about some accolade or some level. What they care about is experiencing the language in the context of speaking with others, reading content, listening to content. And so, a practical way to test that aptitude is, what is your ability to enjoy compelling content? So putting it all together, the reality is that learning a language takes a long time. And as we looked at some of the hour totals from the FSI, it makes sense that it's probably going to take you, maybe a year or two or 3 years, depending on the language, to get to a very high skill level. But that being said, to get to something like a B1 level or a place where you're enjoying compelling content will probably take you a lot less time than that total hour total that we saw with the FSI. And just in my observations with a lot of people's experiences, this kind of time frame, those hour totals seem to make sense. And I want to know, what do you think? What has been your experience? Leave a comment below. Do you disagree, agree? And ultimately, I think it's important to note that levels really don't matter for a lot of people. It's what is your ability to enjoy compelling content. And I think that as you go about learning a language and you try to start reading, listen to interesting audio content, practice speaking, you'll notice that you don't really need to get to that end goal, that end hour total, to start enjoying things. And for a lot of people, that level doesn't matter, right? They just want to enjoy the language process. And if you're enjoying things, you're going to get the time in anyways, and eventually you'll get better at the language and get to some of those kind of more advanced levels. Now, last thoughts I would kind of want to leave you with is that if you're talking about just kind of advancing your skill overall, especially for people that I think are on more of the beginning stages, one of the biggest things that's going to help you to get better at a language and get you to a higher level is vocabulary acquisition. If you can just learn a ton of words, learn the 1,000 most common words in a language, that's going to be so huge for you just getting way better at the language, especially at the beginning stages. Another thing too is that kind of past that beginner stage, I think reading is an amazing way to get better at vocabulary, to get better at grammar, and just to be exposed to the language overall. Another thing too is listening. A lot of people neglect listening, so definitely listen as much as you can. It's a really easy activity to do. And you're probably going to have to put in a lot of time into listening to get to those higher fluency levels or competency levels in a language. And for a lot of people, a lot of the compelling content is things like movies or conversations or video games where you need a solid level of competency with listening. So definitely put time into listening. And ultimately, try to get to a place where you're using compelling content in your language learning, right? Because that's going to help you to get to those hour totals, that longer term target of business proficiency or whatever it is. Because if you're having fun in the language process, you're using compelling content, not only is that content probably going to be pretty effective, but you're going to be having fun, and it's not going to really matter that it takes that long because you're enjoying the process, and eventually with enough time you'll get there. So that's what I had to say about fluency. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.